In the early 1890s, a Scottish-born ethnographer named Alexander Stephen lived among the Hopi at First Mesa, in what is now northeastern Arizona. He filled notebook after notebook with what he saw and what he was told. Around the same years, a Smithsonian researcher named Jesse Walter Fewkes had himself formally initiated into 2 Hopi religious societies. He did this specifically so he could witness ceremonies no outsider had previously been allowed to see. In 1895, Fewkes led a dedicated Bureau of American Ethnology archaeological expedition into Arizona. Among the material these men and others recorded was a tradition the Hopi themselves have carried for generations. It is an account of beings called the Ant People, who sheltered humanity underground when the world above was destroyed. This is not a story the lost record can verify as literal history. It is not a government record or an archaeological find. It is something arguably more significant. It is a living oral tradition, still held by a living nation. Outside researchers began writing it down at almost exactly the moment the same federal government funding some of that research had made practicing that tradition's own ceremonies a punishable crime. At the very same time, that government was forcing Hopi children into government schools by arresting their parents. What follows is an account of that tradition, and of the complicated, sometimes coercive history of outsiders writing it down. The Hopi are a sovereign Native American nation whose villages sit atop 3 mesas in northeastern Arizona. Some of them, including Old Oraibi, are among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the United States, likely founded before the year 1100. Hopi cosmology describes a sequence of previous worlds, often rendered in English as the first, second, and third worlds. Each of these worlds ended in catastrophe, followed by an emergence into the present, fourth world. This emergence narrative is not treated by the Hopi as folklore in the casual sense. It functions as sacred history, tied to ceremony, clan identity, and land. Anthropologists who have worked with Hopi communities describe the tradition as something closer to scripture than legend. They caution that outside retellings are often partial, filtered through whichever individual consented or was pressured to share them with a particular researcher at a particular time. The historical backdrop here is not incidental. It is central to how this material came to be written down at all. In March of 1883, Secretary of the Interior Henry Teller sent a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He called traditional native dances and ceremonies, in his words, hindrances to the civilization of the Indians. The response was the Code of Indian Offenses. This created courts of Indian offenses on reservations, with authority to punish native religious practice, sacred dances, feasts, and the work of traditional medicine people. Punishments included imprisonment or the withholding of food rations for up to 30 days. The code remained federal policy until 1934, the same decade that produced Alexander Stephen's respectful, detailed notebooks, also produced a legal framework under which the ceremonies he was recording could get the people practicing them thrown in jail. Within the Hopi emergence tradition is the account of the Ant People, rendered in the Hopi language as Anu Sinom. According to the tradition as recorded by multiple researchers, the Ant People were small, industrious beings who lived underground. They took the Hopi in during the destruction of an earlier world, sheltering them in vast underground chambers, teaching them to store food carefully, and returning them to the surface once it was safe. Some versions place this rescue during the destruction of the First World, ended by fire. Other tellings place it during the Third World, when the Hopi say the surface was destroyed by flood. The tradition is not uniform across all clans or all informants. This is itself consistent with how oral tradition typically functions. It is carried by multiple households and villages, each preserving its own version, rather than fixed in a single canonical text the way a government document would be. This is where outside documentation enters the story, and where the account becomes as much about the documenters as the tradition itself. Alexander Stephen arrived among the Hopi in the 1880s and settled permanently near First Mesa. He lived close enough to daily and ceremonial life that his notebooks remain one of the most detailed outside records of Hopi ceremony from that era. Those notebooks were later edited and published by anthropologist Elsie Clews Parsons in 1936. As the Hopi Journal. Stephen documented winter solstice observances, initiation ceremonies, and kachina dances between 1891 and his death in 1894. Jesse Walter Fewkes worked in parallel, and more aggressively. Fewkes began studying the Hopi snake ceremony in 1891 and continued for 6 years. To gain deeper access, he arranged to be initiated into the Hopi antelope and flute priesthoods. His own early biographers described this approvingly as the reason he was able to witness and describe secret ceremonies of the tribe for the first time. Fewkes published his findings through the Bureau of American Ethnology's annual reports, including detailed accounts of the snake ceremony covering 1894 through 1898. In 1900, he published a report titled Tusayan Migration Traditions, drawing directly on Hopi accounts of clan origins and movement, the same body of tradition that includes the Ant People narrative. His broader work included a specifically dated 1895 expedition into Arizona for the Bureau. He was also separately involved with the Hemingway Southwestern Expedition, whose collected Hopi and Zuni material was later exhibited at a Smithsonian-affiliated museum. Some of that material was even displayed at Spain's 1892 Historical Exposition in Madrid, marking the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage. Modern scholars have revisited this record critically. Fewkes has been described in recent academic work as someone who conflated distinct tribal cultures and applied Western religious frameworks to interpret Hopi practice. One contemporary analysis explicitly terms this an act of epistemic violence, extracting and repackaging sacred material without the consent structures Hopi religious life would normally require. What was happening to the Hopi themselves during exactly this period puts that ethnographic record in sharper context. In 1893, the federal government opened the Oraibi Day School directly inside the village of Oraibi on Third Mesa. Hopi children were required to attend under federal assimilation policy. Many traditional Hopi parents refused, fearing their children would lose their language and their place in Hopi ceremonial life. In November of 1894, the United States Army arrested roughly 18 Hopi men who would not comply. They were held for about a year at Alcatraz. The underlying conflict did not resolve. It hardened into two named factions. The so-called Friendlies, led first by Chief Lauloma and later by Tawakaptoa, favored working with federal schools and authority. The so-called Hostiles, led by Ukioma of the Spider Clan, believed any accommodation would destroy Hopi tradition entirely. Missionary and ethnographer Henry Voth, the same researcher whose documentation of Hopi ceremony parallels Fewkes and Stuffin's, attempted to mediate as the dispute intensified through the early 1900s. By September of 1906, with Oraibi's population swollen past 700 as both factions prepared for confrontation, the two chiefs settled it with a bloodless pushing contest. It was a physical shoving match across a line drawn in the dirt, watched and partially restrained by Voth to keep it from turning violent. After hours of struggle, the hostiles were pushed across the line and lost. That same night, Ukioma and his followers left Oraibi permanently, walking 6 miles to found a new village, Hotevia. Federal authorities arrested Ukioma again shortly afterward. A further split in 1909 produced a third village, Bukavi. Oraibi, quite possibly the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in the United States, never recovered its population or its former standing as the center of Hopi authority. This is the community, and these are the years from which Stephen, Fewkes, and Voth were simultaneously extracting sacred oral tradition for publication in the American Anthropological Record. The people supplying that material were, in the same decade, being split apart, arrested, and imprisoned over the question of how much of their own culture the federal government would allow them to keep. That tension over ownership of Hopi sacred material came to a head again decades later. In 1963, a non-Hopi author named Frank Waters published a book called The Book of the Hopi, compiled from interviews with roughly 30 Hopi elders and religious leaders. The book became, for decades, the most widely read popular account of Hopi cosmology available to the general public, including its version of the Ant People and the Emergence narrative. The book was also controversial. Some Hopi religious leaders and later scholars have argued that Waters's informants did not have the standing within Hopi religious structure to authorize sharing esoteric material. They argued the book presented as settled and complete a body of knowledge that Hopi tradition treats as selectively transmitted, clan by clan, initiate by initiate, not as a single public text available for purchase in a bookstore. That controversy has never fully resolved. It sits directly downstream of what Fewkes, Stephen, and Voth began 60 years earlier, in the same villages that were simultaneously fighting the government over compulsory schooling. Once sacred material enters a written, published English-language record, it becomes available to be read, reinterpreted, and sold by people entirely outside the community it came from. This holds regardless of whether that community, or the legal and political system governing it at the time, ever authorized the transfer. What can be said with confidence is this: the Ant people tradition is real, is Hopi in origin, and has been part of Hopi oral history for longer than any outside written record of it exists. The earliest substantial outside documentation traces to Alexander Stevens' field notebooks and Jesse Walter Fewkes' Bureau of American Ethnology reports, produced between 1891 and 1900, including Fewkes' specifically dated 1895 Arizona expedition. That expedition was conducted under a legal regime that simultaneously criminalized the ceremonial life he was documenting. In the same years, the Hopi communities supplying that material were being torn apart by federal school policy. What cannot be said with confidence is any claim that the tradition describes literal, physically locatable tunnels, or any detail beyond what has already been made public by Hopi people themselves or their designated representatives. The lost record will not present pseudo-archaeological claims, ancient-astronaut theories, or literal alien hybrid readings of the Ant people that circulate widely online, as though they carry the same weight as the tradition itself. Those readings are not Hopi tradition. They are additions made by outside writers generations later for their own purposes. Today, the Ant people story circulates far outside any Hopi context. It largely spreads through websites and videos built around ancient astronaut and hollow earth speculation. Several of these layer in unrelated claims about Egyptian hieroglyphs in Grand Canyon caves, claims with no archaeological support, and a documented history of debunking going back to a discredited 1909 newspaper hoax. That popular version bears only a loose resemblance to what Hopi people actually say about their own tradition. It is a case study in what happens to a living nation's sacred history once it leaves that nation's control. First, through initiations arranged for access rather than genuine spiritual commitment, conducted under a federal legal code that criminalized the ceremonies being infiltrated, while the same communities were being forcibly split over government schooling. Then, through Bureau of American Ethnology reports. Then, through a popular 1963 book whose own authority was contested by the community it claimed to represent. And finally, through a modern internet ecosystem that strips away every remaining trace of who the story actually belongs to. The Hopi are not alone in this pattern. Other nations of the American Southwest, including the Navajo and Zuni, hold their own emergence traditions describing survival through earlier, destroyed worlds. Each has faced comparable outside documentation, comparable popularization, and comparable loss of control over how their own sacred history circulates. These are separate, distinct traditions belonging to separate, distinct nations, not variations on a single universal myth. Treating them as interchangeable would repeat exactly the flattening error historians now criticize in Fewkes' own work. The Ant people remain, in Hopi tradition, a real part of how the Hopi understand their own survival across multiple ages of the world. That belief does not require external verification to matter to the people who hold it. The lost record is not in a position to confirm or deny sacred history that belongs to someone else. What can be documented is this. In the early 1890s, at First Mesa, an ethnographer moved in permanently to observe. A Smithsonian researcher arranged his own initiation into 2 priesthoods specifically to gain access he would not otherwise have been given. At the exact moment the ceremonies surrounding that access were, under federal law, a punishable offense. By 1895, that researcher was leading a formal government expedition through Hopi land. Within the same 15 years, the community supplying this material was split permanently in 2, its children taken by soldiers to government schools, its most traditional families walking 6 miles into the desert rather than comply. The tunnels the tradition describes were never meant to be found by outsiders. The historical record shows outsiders went looking anyway, in the middle of tearing the community that held that tradition apart.